What if the person you loved the most betrayed you in the worst way? What if your husband not only cheated, but did it publicly, cruelly, and without remorse? Meet Tracy, a devoted wife whose world crumbled overnight. But instead of revenge, she chose something far more powerful: dignity. This story will take you through heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately, a triumphant transformation you won't see coming. So grab a seat, because what happens next is proof that karma is real and grace is even stronger. Let's dive into this unforgettable story of love, loss, and sweet redemption. The mornings in Paul's home were colder than the weather outside, and Tracy felt it with every breath she took. She sat alone at the kitchen counter, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, while Paul scrolled through his phone, barely sparing her a glance. She wore a soft blue house dress, one he used to say brought out the warmth in her skin, but now it was as if he didn't even notice her existence. "You're heading out early?" Tracy asked quietly, her voice almost hesitant. Paul didn't look up. "Work's busy," he mumbled, grabbing his keys with an impatient clatter. Tracy watched him move, feeling like a stranger in her own home, wondering how love could wither so silently. She pressed her palm against her chest, trying to steady the ache there, pretending not to notice the way Paul's phone buzzed repeatedly, the name Cindy flashing once too often. Something inside her was breaking, slowly, methodically. But she wore her best armor, a smile no one could see through. She told herself it was just a rough patch. She told herself he would come back to her. But deep down, a small voice whispered that some cracks never heal. They only grow wider. Later that evening, Tracy sat curled up on the couch, her favorite romance novel open, but unread on her lap. Paul's voice floated from the study down the hallway, laughter she hadn't heard directed at her in months. As she strained to hear, bits of conversation trickled out. Light teasing, flirtatious chuckles, the kind of intimacy that once belonged to them. Her heart twisted painfully. She stood up, walking quietly toward the door, but before she could knock, she froze at the sound of Paul's voice. "Yeah, don't worry, she'll come to the reunion," he was saying. "I want everyone to see what I traded up for." Tracy's breath caught. She backed away slowly, her vision blurring. He wasn't just ignoring her. He was plotting to humiliate her. Tears burned her eyes, but she wiped them away fiercely. She wouldn't cry for a man who didn't see her worth. She wouldn't break, not yet. In that moment, standing in the dim hallway of a home that no longer felt hers, Tracy made a silent vow to herself. Whatever storm was coming, she would survive it, quietly, gracefully. She would endure, and when the time came, she would rise. Cindy leaned against the edge of Paul's mahogany desk, her crimson lips curved into a smirk as she scrolled through pictures on her phone. "You're seriously still letting her walk in there beside you?" she purred, tossing her glossy hair over her shoulder. Paul glanced up, the faintest trace of irritation on his face. "She's harmless," he muttered, but Cindy wasn't having it. She sauntered closer, perching herself on his lap like a queen addressing her subject. "Paul, listen to me," she whispered in his ear. "Everyone at the reunion will think you've downgraded if you show up with that." Her words oozed into his mind like venom. "You deserve someone dazzling, someone worthy of you." Her manicured fingers trailed along his jawline. "Let them see who you chose over her." Paul's defenses melted in the heat of her touch. In his mind, an image formed. Tracy standing awkwardly beside Cindy, dull and invisible. The idea fed his ego, wrapping around him like a warm coat. Cindy watched the shift in his eyes with satisfaction. She was a master at planting seeds of doubt and destruction, and tonight she was sowing a forest. The plan came together over whispered conversations and stolen kisses, each word another dagger aimed squarely at Tracy's heart. "Maybe we should make a bit of a show," Cindy suggested lightly, tracing lazy circles on Paul's chest. Laugh a little louder. Dance a little closer. Let her see what she lost. Paul chuckled, a low, cruel sound that vibrated in his chest. "You're wicked," he teased, pulling her closer. Cindy leaned in, her voice a breathy caress. "Only for you." She knew she had him wrapped around her finger, and she knew Paul's arrogance made him blind to consequences. Their laughter filled the room, a sharp contrast to the silence that hung heavy where Tracy sat downstairs, unaware of the stage being set. Every time Cindy whispered another suggestion, Paul felt more powerful, more justified. Tracy, in his mind, was the forgotten page in a book he had long closed. Cindy fed his fantasy until it grew monstrous, until Paul could no longer see the woman who once waited patiently at their doorstep in the rain, believing he would open the door. Now all he saw was a chance, a cruel, fleeting chance to feel superior again. Paul waited until dinner time, choosing the moment when Tracy's defenses would be lowest. She sat across the table, gently stirring her bowl of soup, wearing a look of habitual politeness. He watched her for a moment, then leaned back casually in his chair. "Hey, Trace," he said, his voice feigning warmth. "There's a reunion this Saturday. Thought we could go together, show face." Tracy looked up, startled by the unexpected invitation. A small, hopeful smile tugged at her lips before she quickly masked it. "You want me to come with you?" she asked carefully. Paul shrugged nonchalantly, stabbing a piece of meat with his fork. "Yeah, everyone will be there. Good food. Catch up with old friends. Could be fun." He didn't meet her eyes, busying himself with his plate, but inside he was already picturing the scene, her standing awkwardly beside him while Cindy bloomed like a rose beside a wilted daisy. Tracy, oblivious to the cruel undertones, nodded slowly. "All right," she said softly. "I'll come." Hope flickered in her chest, a foolish, stubborn hope she couldn't quite extinguish. After dinner, Tracy found herself standing by the closet, running her fingers over clothes she hadn't touched in months. "Maybe," she whispered to herself, "maybe he's trying." She picked out a soft peach dress, simple, understated, and held it against herself in the mirror, imagining for a brief, fragile moment that this night could be a new beginning. Meanwhile, Paul texted Cindy from the bathroom. "She's coming. Get ready to have some fun." The reply came instantly, a laughing emoji followed by, "She won't know what hit her." Paul smirked, pocketing his phone before rejoining Tracy in the living room, where she sat carefully polishing a pair of modest heels. "You'll look beautiful," he said casually, a statement so empty it stung even as it made her heart flutter. Tracy glanced up, blinking rapidly to keep tears from falling. "Thanks, Paul," she whispered. In her mind, she painted over the cracks with bright colors, pretending that maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to be seen again. But Paul wasn't offering a hand. He was handing her a loaded gun with no warning of the wound it would cause. The days leading up to the reunion were filled with preparations, but not the kind Tracy imagined. Paul and Cindy met secretly at a downtown cafe, laughing over lattes as they mapped out every painful moment. "You'll introduce me as your real partner," Cindy purred, stirring her coffee with a silver spoon. "And I'll make sure everyone knows Tracy's just tagging along out of pity." Paul leaned back, arms crossed, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "She won't even see it coming," he said smugly. Cindy giggled, tapping her manicured nails on the table. "Exactly. And when they see how radiant we look together?" She trailed off, letting the image hang between them like a twisted dream. Paul nodded. "It'll be a night to remember." Their laughter mingled with the clink of cups and the hum of oblivious patrons, a sharp, ugly sound beneath the cafe's soft music. Every word they exchanged was another step in a dance of betrayal, choreographed with precision and venom. Meanwhile, Tracy spent her evenings meticulously ironing her chosen dress, smoothing every wrinkle with trembling hands. She applied a homemade face mask, hoping the tiredness in her eyes would fade by Saturday. Maybe Paul will see me again, she thought, pressing a hand to her chest where hope still stubbornly bloomed. She hadn't told anyone about the reunion, wanting to believe it would be a quiet, healing night. In the quiet of her bedroom, she rehearsed small smiles and light conversations, reminding herself how to blend into a crowd without disappearing completely. She didn't see the trap being laid before her feet. She didn't hear the whispers, the mocking laughter that would greet her. All she carried was her fragile faith that somehow, she still mattered to the man she once called her world. In her innocence, she polished her shoes a second time, checking herself in the mirror. "You're enough, Tracy," she whispered, offering herself the comfort Paul no longer did. "You're enough." The night before the reunion, Tracy stood at the window of the bedroom she used to share with Paul, staring into the darkness beyond. The wind rattled the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. But inside their home, the silence was crushing. She ran her fingers along the edge of the dresser, touching old framed photographs. Birthdays, anniversaries, fleeting smiles from a different lifetime. A lump formed in her throat as she lifted one of the frames, their wedding photo, and studied the woman she used to be. Full of hope. Full of life. She pressed the frame to her chest for a moment, breathing in the memories before quietly setting it face down. Somewhere along the way, Paul had stopped seeing her. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped loving her. Yet foolishly, Tracy had continued believing that if she just held on tighter, he might remember who she was. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself. "I'll remind him. Not with anger, not with tears, just by being the woman he had forgotten how to love." She reached for the simple silver necklace Paul had once given her, slipping it around her neck like fragile armor. Downstairs, Paul was sprawled across the sofa, laughing into his phone, oblivious to the ache pulsing through the house. "Yeah, bro, just wait till you see her. She's a shadow of herself," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Cindy's going to shine beside her like a damn spotlight." Tracy heard the muted chuckle and clenched her hands into fists, willing herself not to cry. Instead, she tiptoed back upstairs, each step heavier than the last. In the bathroom, she brushed her hair in silence, smoothing the strands into a soft twist at the nape of her neck. She didn't see the woman Paul saw. She saw resilience. She saw survival. Tomorrow wasn't about revenge. It was about walking into a room full of people who counted her out and refusing to let their whispers crush her. Tomorrow, she would no longer be the forgotten wife. Even if she was invisible to Paul, she would see herself. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. As she turned out the light, the shadows swallowed her form, but inside her chest, a stubborn ember of dignity still burned. In a quiet part of town, nestled between glass towers and bustling cafes, Tracy climbed the stairs of a modest office building. Her palms were sweaty, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. She adjusted the strap of her purse and hesitated in front of the polished oak door before pushing it open. Kenneth looked up from his desk the moment she entered, his expression softening instantly. "Tracy," he said warmly, standing to greet her. She smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing. Kenneth's presence had a way of grounding her, a calm, unwavering strength that never demanded anything from her. "I needed to see you before tomorrow," Tracy said, her voice trembling only slightly. Kenneth crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hands gently in his. "You don't owe them anything," he said quietly. "You don't have to prove a thing." Tracy shook her head. "I know, but I have to face it for myself." Kenneth studied her, pride flickering in his deep-set eyes. "Then you won't do it alone," he promised. They sat together by the wide window, the city lights stretching into the horizon. Tracy leaned into Kenneth's steady presence, feeling the strength she had been denied for so long. "Paul thinks he's walking me into a trap," she said bitterly, twining her fingers together. Kenneth's jaw tightened. "Let him think that," he replied. "It'll make it all the sweeter when he realizes you're far beyond his reach." Tracy smiled faintly. "You're not coming tomorrow?" she said, more as a question than a statement. Kenneth chuckled lowly. "You said you wanted to handle this your way. I'll be there, but only if you want me visible." Tracy's eyes shimmered with emotion. "Stay hidden," she whispered. "Let me show him without saying a word." Kenneth lifted her hand to his lips, brushing a kiss across her knuckles. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Tracy," he murmured. "No matter what happens, remember you are not defined by their cruelty." Tracy blinked back tears, nodding silently. For the first time in months, she didn't feel small. She felt seen, cherished. And tomorrow, she'd carry that unseen strength like a crown. The memory of their wedding was tucked safely within Tracy's heart, a quiet treasure few knew about. It had been a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the sun kissed the earth, but the wind kept it honest. She had worn a simple white dress, no frills, no crowd, just a soft silk gown that fluttered around her ankles. Kenneth had waited for her under a sprawling oak tree in the garden of a small country inn, dressed not in a tuxedo, but in a dark, tailored suit that made his eyes seem even warmer. Tracy had walked towards him barefoot, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers, her heart pounding with disbelief that after everything, after Paul's indifference, after the loneliness that clawed at her, someone wanted her. "I'm not marrying your past, Tracy," Kenneth had said as he placed a ring on her finger. "I'm marrying your future." She had cried then, not out of sadness, but out of the overwhelming, frightening, beautiful reality of being chosen, truly chosen. Back in the present, Tracy sat by the window with a small velvet box in her lap, the wedding band Kenneth had given her. She turned it over between her fingers, a bittersweet smile playing at her lips. It was not flashy or heavy with gemstones. It was simple, elegant, full of meaning, just like the love they shared. They had agreed to keep their marriage quiet until Tracy felt ready to let go of her old life fully. She hadn't wanted her new beginning overshadowed by whispers of scandal or pity. Kenneth had understood without question. He had never pushed, never demanded she hurry her healing. As she looked at the golden band now, Tracy thought about the reunion and the cruel trap being set for her. They didn't know the woman walking into that hall wasn't the battered soul they had left behind. They didn't know she was no longer alone. With a deep breath, Tracy slipped the ring back into its box and tucked it into her purse. It wasn't time to reveal that part yet. Tomorrow was about standing tall, not for them, but for herself. The next morning, Kenneth stood in the kitchen of their private penthouse, brewing coffee the way Tracy liked, a soft blend with a hint of vanilla. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, like a man who had mastered patience in a world always rushing. When Tracy entered, barefoot and in one of his oversized shirts, he simply smiled and handed her a cup without saying a word. She accepted it with both hands, drawing warmth from more than just the coffee. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, her eyes searching his. Kenneth leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching her with a gaze that never wavered. "I know," he replied simply. "But I want to. I want to remind you every moment that you're not walking into that room alone." Tracy sipped her coffee, letting the rich flavor anchor her fraying nerves. "Even if they laugh?" she asked quietly. Kenneth's eyes darkened, but his voice remained steady. "Especially if they laugh," he said. "Their ignorance doesn't diminish your worth. it exposes theirs. Later, as Tracy packed her simple jewelry and chosen dress into a small garment bag, Kenneth came up behind her, resting his hands lightly on her shoulders. "You have nothing to prove," he said again, his voice a low reassurance against the rising tide of doubt she tried so hard to contain. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling his certainty seep into her skin like sunlight. "I know," she whispered, though her heart still trembled. Kenneth turned her gently to face him, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. "Let them see a woman they couldn't destroy," he said. "Let them regret ever underestimating you." Tracy swallowed the lump in her throat. "You really believe in me that much?" Kenneth smiled, that rare, breathtaking smile he saved only for her. "I believe in you more than you believe in yourself. But that's all right. Until you do, I'll believe enough for both of us." Tracy laughed, a sound that was half sob, half relief, and buried her face in his chest. In that quiet, unbreakable embrace, she found her answer. She wasn't walking into a war to fight. She was walking into a room already victorious. They just didn't know it yet. Tracy stood before the full-length mirror, slipping into the dress she had chosen with trembling hands. It wasn't a grand gown dripping with diamonds or stitched with designer labels. It was a soft, dove-gray piece, hugging her body in just the right places without shouting for attention. The neckline was simple, the hemline modest, but the way it floated around her ankles made her feel ethereal, untouchable. She ran her fingers lightly across the fabric, letting its softness remind her that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Kenneth leaned against the doorway, watching her silently. "You're beautiful," he said, reverence lacing every syllable. Tracy turned toward him, smoothing down the sides of the dress. "It's plain," she said with a small, almost self-conscious shrug. Kenneth shook his head. "No, Trace, it's perfect. You don't need glitter to outshine them. You already do." His words settled over her like a protective veil, calming the storm brewing in her chest. Tracy turned back to the mirror, her reflection meeting her gaze with surprising steadiness. She pinned her hair into a low, loose bun, letting a few soft strands frame her face. She chose a single pair of pearl earrings, a quiet nod to her mother's elegance, and slipped her feet into simple nude heels. No flashy designer bag, no screaming labels, just herself, refined, understated, and utterly unbreakable. Kenneth stepped forward, holding a thin silver bracelet between his fingers. "May I?" he asked. Tracy nodded, lifting her wrist. He clasped it gently around her arm, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "This isn't for them," he said, his voice a tender murmur only she could hear. "It's for you." Tracy felt tears prick the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. Tonight wasn't about proving anything. It was about reclaiming the pieces of herself that had been chipped away by years of indifference. She smiled, a real luminous smile, and whispered, "Thank you, Kenneth." In her reflection, she saw not a forgotten wife, not a discarded memory, but a woman who had survived the storm and still stood tall. Cindy lounged across a plush chair at the salon, flipping through magazines while a stylist curled her long hair into cascading waves. She smirked at her reflection, admiring the sharp cut of her red cocktail dress that hung on the nearby rack. "He won't even look at her," she said aloud, tossing the magazine aside. "He's going to realize the second we walk in that he upgraded." The stylist gave a polite, non-committal laugh, clearly used to overhearing vain clients. Cindy checked her phone, scrolling through pictures of Paul in his tailored suit, herself draped on his arm like a trophy. "Poor Tracy," she said in mock sympathy, pouting at the mirror. Showing up looking like some charity case. She imagined the shocked looks on their classmates' faces, the whispers, the stifled laughter. It gave her a heady rush of satisfaction. She was ready to show the world that Paul had chosen better, smarter, prettier. That evening, in a flurry of expensive perfume and designer heels, Cindy posed beside Paul for a quick photo before they left. "You ready to steal the show, baby?" she teased, slipping her arm through his. Paul grinned, adjusting his cufflinks. "Tracy won't know what hit her," he said with a chuckle. In the car, Cindy rehearsed her smiles, practiced the tilt of her chin, the way she'd subtly flaunt the bracelet Paul had bought her, a piece that sparkled far more ostentatiously than the simple jewelry she imagined Tracy would wear. "When we walk in," Cindy instructed smoothly, "make sure you introduce me first. I want everyone to see who the real woman in your life is." Paul nodded distractedly, texting one of his old college friends. Cindy glanced at him, and for a fleeting moment, felt a sliver of unease. The casual way he treated loyalty, the ease with which he discarded. But she quickly buried the thought beneath layers of confidence and ambition. After tonight, Tracy would be nothing but a sad shadow, fading into the background. Cindy smiled to herself, picturing the moment of triumph, the sweet taste of victory on the tip of her tongue. The parking lot of the Grand Hotel buzzed with laughter and anticipation as former classmates hugged and exchanged pleasantries under the glittering chandeliers spilling through the tall glass windows. Paul adjusted his jacket and extended a hand toward Cindy, who stepped out of the car as if arriving for a red carpet event. Her dress shimmered, her makeup flawless, and she leaned possessively into Paul's side. They entered the lobby to a flurry of impressed murmurs. "Wow, Paul really scored," someone whispered. Cindy's smile widened. Across the room, heads turned, eager to catch sight of the old couple they remembered, but not in the way Cindy imagined. Moments later, Tracy stepped through the entrance, her simple gray gown flowing softly around her, her posture serene. She didn't need the flash of sequins or the jangle of jewelry to command attention. A hush fell over the room as Tracy's elegance cut through the noise like a whisper through a storm. She didn't scan the room looking for approval. She simply walked forward, her head high, as if she owned the ground she walked on. Paul barely concealed his sneer. "There she is," he muttered under his breath to Cindy. Cindy squeezed his arm and giggled, but her laughter wavered as she noticed the curious expressions around the room. Instead of snickers or pointed fingers, there was an odd stillness, eyes following Tracy not with ridicule, but with awe. Tracy made her way to a quiet corner, her steps unhurried, acknowledging a few old classmates with polite smiles. She knew what was happening. She could feel the subtle shift in the air. They had expected a ghost of a woman, beaten down, desperate. Instead, she gave them grace and dignity. As she stood by the refreshment table, a few women approached hesitantly, offering guarded compliments. "You look different, Tracy," one murmured. "Beautiful," another added under her breath. Tracy simply smiled, the corners of her eyes soft. She didn't need to explain where she'd been, what she'd endured. Her presence spoke louder than any words. And though Paul and Cindy whispered feverishly between themselves, plotting how to turn the tide, Tracy had already won a silent victory, one they hadn't even realized was unfolding. It started small, a ripple barely noticeable at first. A couple near the bar leaned in, whispering behind raised glasses. The group by the stage exchanged glances before murmuring among themselves. One by one, old classmates who hadn't seen Tracy in years found themselves caught off guard by the quiet power she carried. She wasn't the timid, shrinking woman many remembered. There was a strength in her posture, a peace in her smile that couldn't be faked. "I heard she's doing really well now," a woman in a navy blue dress whispered to her husband. "Better than Paul, that's for sure." Another group huddled near the punch table, speculating about Tracy's life. "She doesn't look like someone struggling," a man muttered, furrowing his brow. "Look at that ring on her finger. That's not cheap," his friend nodded thoughtfully. The murmurs traveled like wildfire, spreading doubt, curiosity, and grudging admiration. Paul, oblivious to the growing stir, was too busy basking in the early attention he and Cindy received. Cindy, however, caught the shifting undercurrent. She tugged at Paul's sleeve. "They're staring!" she hissed under her breath, eyes darting nervously around the room. "Good," Paul said smugly, smoothing down his jacket. "Let them see what they missed out on." But Cindy wasn't so sure anymore. She noticed how women looked at Tracy, not with pity, but with a strange kind of respect. Men, too, glanced at her longer than was necessary, their conversations momentarily stalling when she passed by. Even the event organizer, a respected alumnus named Jordan, made a beeline for Tracy, offering her a warm, deferential greeting. "Tracy," Jordan said warmly, shaking her hand. "It's been far too long. You look incredible." Tracy smiled, sincere but reserved. "Thank you, Jordan. It's good to see everyone again." Paul scowled from a distance, irritation simmering under his skin. Things were not going the way he had imagined. Cindy squeezed his arm tighter, her nails digging in, both of them silently realizing that the woman they thought they'd crushed had somehow risen far above their reach. Desperation brewed in Cindy's chest as she watched Tracy move through the room, collecting glances and hushed admiration without even trying. She couldn't allow this narrative to settle. It was supposed to be her night. With a sugary smile pasted on her face, Cindy tugged Paul along toward the small gathering where Tracy stood. "Oh my gosh, Tracy!" Cindy gushed loudly, drawing attention. "You made it." The falseness in her tone was so thick it practically oozed onto the marble floor. Tracy turned slowly, her smile polite but cautious. "Hello, Cindy," she said softly, giving nothing away. Cindy pressed on, undeterred. "It's so good to see you," she said, looping her arm through Paul's and leaning her head on his shoulder dramatically. "We were just talking about how brave you are for coming tonight. You know, after everything." Her voice dropped into a sickly sweet tone that barely concealed the venom. A few people nearby pretended not to listen, but their ears were tuned in, catching every syllable. Tracy's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face serene. She tilted her head slightly, her voice steady as she replied, "Life has a way of teaching you resilience, Cindy." Cindy blinked, momentarily thrown off by Tracy's calmness. Paul, emboldened by Cindy's jab, chuckled under his breath. "Well, I guess not everyone gets a fairy tale ending, huh?" he said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. A few awkward laughs escaped, but the tension was palpable. Tracy smiled gently, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. "True," she said, sipping her drink slowly. "But sometimes what looks like an ending is just the beginning of something far more beautiful." Her words hung in the air, cutting sharper than any insult Cindy or Paul could have crafted. The little cluster around them grew silent, exchanging looks. Cindy's fingers dug harder into Paul's arm, panic flickering across her face. She had swung the first punch, expecting Tracy to crumble, but instead, she had exposed her own desperation for all to see. And Tracy stood taller, steadier, her quiet dignity louder than any cruel word could ever be. From across the banquet hall, hidden among a group of investors and alumni, Kenneth stood silently with a glass of champagne in hand. His tailored dark suit hugged his broad shoulders effortlessly, his expression unreadable, yet somehow commanding. He kept his distance, respecting Tracy's wishes, but his eyes never strayed far from her. He watched as she navigated each passive-aggressive comment, with poise, never raising her voice, never showing the crack that trembled beneath the surface. Kenneth's fingers tightened around the stem of his glass when Paul threw his head back in another boisterous laugh, showing off like a clown desperate for attention. A man beside Kenneth, an old professor, leaned over, unaware of Kenneth's connection. "Pity about Tracy," he said. "Paul really threw her under the bus years ago. Look at her now, though. She's unbreakable." Kenneth nodded slightly, pride swelling quietly inside him. He would remain in the shadows tonight, but he knew if Tracy stumbled even a little, he would be there to catch her before she ever hit the ground. Meanwhile, Tracy felt the heat of the room closing in on her. Though she smiled and nodded politely at conversations, the strain pressed against her ribs like a vice. Her gaze flickered instinctively across the room, and there, partially hidden by the crowd, she caught a glimpse of Kenneth. Their eyes locked for a fleeting heartbeat, and it was enough. In that small, secret exchange, she drew breath again. She straightened her spine and let herself exhale slowly, feeling anchored by the silent encouragement pouring from him. No one else noticed, and that was the beauty of it. Kenneth wasn't here to parade around or steal the moment. He was here solely for her, a living reminder that she was loved beyond measure, even when surrounded by those who once celebrated her downfall. Tracy turned back to the group she was speaking with, her voice stronger, her laughter lighter. She didn't need to fight fire with fire. She had something far more devastating: quiet, unstoppable resilience, and an unseen champion who believed in her even when she had forgotten how to believe in herself. Feeling the crowd's shifting attention, Paul decided to escalate his performance, oblivious to the undercurrents he was stirring. "It's funny," he said loudly to a circle of classmates, drawing more listeners with every word. "How life turns out. Some people just peak early, you know?" His grin was wide, insufferable, as he cast a pointed glance toward Tracy without bothering to hide it. Cindy laughed on cue, looping her arm through his possessively. "Some of us just move on to better things," she added with a sugary tilt of her head. The crowd gave polite chuckles, but there was an awkwardness lacing the air now, as if everyone understood the cruelty beneath their words, but didn't dare challenge it openly. Paul took a long sip of his drink, encouraged by the few scattered laughs, mistaking their discomfort for admiration. He swaggered through the room, exaggerating his importance, dropping names and bragging about a promotion that barely scratched the surface of true success. To him, image was everything, and tonight he thought he had the perfect one. Tracy watched from a distance, feeling both pity and a pang of old hurt. She hadn't expected Paul to change. Not really. But seeing how desperately he clung to the illusion of success, how he needed Cindy's validation like oxygen, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't anticipated. Ellen, a former classmate she hadn't seen in years, drifted over with a soft smile. "You're handling this with such grace, Tracy," Ellen whispered. "Honestly, it's inspiring to watch." Tracy's throat tightened. She managed a small laugh. "Survival leaves no room for bitterness," she said quietly. Ellen's eyes warmed. If only they understood the difference between real success and cheap spectacle. Across the room, Paul continued to laugh too loudly, drawing attention to himself with every arrogant word. What he didn't realize was that the more he spoke, the smaller he appeared. Tracy didn't need to raise her voice or retaliate. Paul's own actions were painting him into the very corner he thought he had trapped her in. And for once, she didn't feel like a victim standing in his shadow. She felt like someone who had finally stepped out into the light. As the evening wore on, the energy in the room shifted further, from polite tolerance to barely concealed intrigue. Ellen, sipping her wine thoughtfully, decided she had seen enough. She drifted into a conversation nearby, dropping a comment loud enough to catch ears. "It's amazing how far Tracy's come, considering everything she endured," she said lightly. A few heads snapped up. "You know," Ellen continued, her tone artfully casual, "some people think they're climbing ladders, but it turns out they've been digging holes instead." The meaning wasn't lost on anyone. Paul, hearing the ripples of laughter that followed, felt his face tighten. He turned sharply toward Tracy, only to find her laughing gently at something Jordan was saying, her eyes crinkling at the corners, her body language effortless. She didn't look broken. She didn't even look bruised. She looked free, and it scared him in a way he hadn't expected. Meanwhile, conversations crackled quietly across the room, seeds of doubt blooming like wildfire. "Did you hear?" a woman whispered to her companion. "Tracy's remarried. Heard her husband's some kind of investor." Another chimed in. "I think he's here tonight. No one's seen him yet, though." Paul caught fragments of these whispers and stiffened, the hair on the back of his neck prickling. Cindy clung tighter to his side, sensing the shift but unable to control it. "Ignore them," she hissed. "They're just jealous." But Paul couldn't ignore it. He saw the way the tide was turning, not because Tracy was shouting for attention, but because her very presence made their petty cruelty look cheap. Ellen approached Tracy again, her smile laced with meaning. "Some people shine brightest when they stop waiting for permission," she said softly. Tracy smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe some lights are meant to burn quietly," she replied, "till the right time comes." And that time Tracy could feel it stirring was almost here. The doors to the banquet hall opened again with a soft creak, and a quiet murmur rippled through the room. Kenneth entered with an easy, unhurried stride, his dark, tailored suit absorbing the light, his presence commanding but not boastful. He moved among the guests with effortless grace, exchanging polite nods, a faint smile playing on his lips. To most people, he appeared to be just another successful businessman, aloof, mysterious, untouchable. But a few sharp-eyed guests noticed how the air shifted subtly around him, how conversations paused when he passed by. Without announcing himself, Kenneth's aura demanded respect. He found a spot near one of the tall windows, deliberately positioning himself where he could observe Tracy from a distance without drawing suspicion. To anyone else, he was simply another investor. But to Tracy, when she glanced up and found him there, it was as if the earth had steadied beneath her feet. Paul noticed the stir, the subtle glances people threw toward the newcomer, and curiosity gnawed at him. "Who's that?" he muttered to Cindy, who craned her neck slightly to look. "No idea," she said with a tight smile. "Probably another boring suit trying to show off." But Kenneth didn't parade himself. He didn't flash wealth or seek attention. Instead, it was his restraint, his composed silence, that pulled eyes toward him like gravity. As people whispered guesses about his identity, Tracy moved easily through the crowd, exchanging quiet greetings, her confidence no longer just a shield, but a natural part of her presence. She caught Kenneth's eye briefly, and the faintest tilt of his head told her everything she needed to know. "I'm here. I've got you." Tracy smiled softly to herself, her heart calming despite the mounting tension in the room. Tonight wasn't about showing off power. It was about owning the quiet, relentless strength that had carried her through the darkest storms. And Kenneth was the silent pillar standing firm behind her. As Tracy mingled quietly, Ellen wasn't the only one rallying silently to her side. Former classmates who had once been bystanders or even skeptics found themselves unable to resist the urge to gravitate toward her. One by one, they approached under the pretense of casual conversation, but their words carried more weight. "You've changed, Tracy," said James, an old classmate who had barely spared her a glance back in college. "It's admirable." Another, Melissa, leaned in with a wink. "I always thought you deserved better than what you got." Their voices were hushed, but the sincerity was unmistakable. Tracy listened politely, offering soft thank yous, her heart swelling with a complicated mixture of emotions: validation, sadness, and quiet triumph. These weren't just compliments. They were acknowledgments of battles fought in silence, of victories they could only now begin to understand. Paul and Cindy, standing off to the side, watch the shifting energy with increasing alarm. "What is happening?" Cindy hissed under her breath, her fingers clenching the stem of her wineglass. Paul shook his head, his mouth a thin, furious line. "They're just being polite," he said stiffly. But even he didn't believe it. He saw the way people lingered around Tracy, the respect evident in their body language. Worse, he noticed that no one clung to his words anymore. No one laughed at his jokes quite as heartily. Cindy, desperate to recapture the spotlight, sidled up to a nearby group and tried to inject herself into their conversation. "Paul and I just got back from a trip to Paris," she said loudly, flashing her bracelet. But the reaction was muted, distracted, as the group's attention wandered inevitably back toward Tracy. Standing in the center of it all, Tracy didn't gloat, didn't preen. She simply stood, serene and luminous, while the tide shifted irrevocably in her favor. Without raising her voice, without seeking vengeance, she was being elevated, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. Cindy's smile strained at the corners as she watched Tracy command silent admiration without a single flashy accessory or desperate boast. Panic gnawed at her carefully constructed image, and she tightened her grip on Paul's arm. "Do something," she whispered harshly, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal's. Paul shrugged her off irritably, muttering, "You're the one who wanted the show, remember?" But Cindy knew if she didn't act fast, she would fade into the background like a wilted flower next to Tracy's effortless bloom. Driven by a mixture of fear and fury, she stepped deliberately toward Kenneth, who stood near the windows, quietly sipping his drink. She offered her brightest, most dazzling smile. "Hi there," she purred, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I don't think we've met. Cindy, Paul's fiancée." Her voice dripped with sweetness, but her eyes were calculating, searching for a crack in Kenneth's armor she could exploit. Kenneth looked at her hand, then at her, his expression unreadable. Slowly, almost politely, he shook her hand and then immediately let go. "Kenneth?" he said, his voice cool, offering nothing more. Cindy tilted her head, sensing that the usual charm offensive wasn't working. She laughed lightly, trying again. "You must be new around here. Stick with us, we're the life of the party," she said, fluttering her lashes shamelessly. Kenneth merely smiled thinly, his gaze already drifting past her, back to where Tracy stood, radiant even in her stillness. Realizing she was being dismissed without even a word, Cindy's cheeks flushed red with anger. She turned back to Paul, her steps stiff, her mouth set in a hard line. "Who is that guy?" she hissed. Paul frowned, finally, truly noticing Kenneth's effortless power. "No idea," he muttered, but a sick feeling twisted in his gut. Cindy's desperation had backfired, and instead of dimming Tracy's light, all she had done was reveal just how small and desperate she herself had become. And the night wasn't even close to over yet. The soft clinking of glasses drew everyone's attention as Paul swaggered to the center of the hall, a half-filled wine glass raised high. His voice, slightly slurred from too much champagne, rang out with forced cheerfulness. "Everyone," he called, flashing a wide grin. "Can I get your attention for just a minute?" Conversations died down reluctantly, a hush falling over the room. Tracy froze where she stood, her fingers curling lightly around her glass, already sensing the cruelty lining Paul's words before he even spoke them. Cindy beamed proudly by his side, clearly believing the moment would finally cement their triumph. Paul cleared his throat dramatically, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Let's raise a glass," he said loudly, pausing to sweep the room with his gaze. "To resilience, to bouncing back after life's little setbacks." His eyes locked onto Tracy, the message unmistakable. Some guests chuckled uncomfortably. Others shifted awkwardly, sensing the ugliness beneath his joke but unsure how to react. Before the silence could thicken into humiliation, a second glass lifted into the air, steady, deliberate and commanding attention without a single word. Kenneth stepped forward from the side of the room, his presence instantly drawing eyes like a magnet. "I'll drink to that," he said calmly, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. But unlike Paul's mockery, there was nothing cruel in Kenneth's tone. He turned to face Tracy fully, lifting his glass a little higher. "To those who rise stronger, who wear their scars like armor, and whose worth isn't measured by those too small to recognize it." The room seemed to hold its breath for a beat. No one moved. Then slowly, murmurs of agreement and scattered applause broke out. Tracy's heart hammered in her chest as her eyes met Kenneth's across the crowd, steady, sure, unshakable. Paul stood frozen, his smirk faltering, confusion clouding his features. Cindy's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. In a single, effortless move, Kenneth had taken Paul's weapon and turned it into a shield for Tracy. And the room, once leaning toward mockery, now leaned toward awe. Paul's hand lowered slowly, his smirk collapsing into a tight, sour grimace. The applause continued for a few moments longer, scattered but sincere, and Tracy could feel the tide of the evening fully, finally, turning in her favor. Kenneth didn't rush. He walked toward her with easy, confident strides, each step dismissing Paul's attempted cruelty without needing a single harsh word. He stopped a respectful distance from her, holding out his hand. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said smoothly, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "May I have this dance?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. "Mrs. Whitmore." Recognition sparked in a few faces, followed by a flurry of whispers. Kenneth Whitmore, the discreet billionaire investor. Paul's head snapped toward Tracy, his face pale, disbelieving. Cindy blinked furiously, trying to process what she had just heard. Tracy hesitated only for a fraction of a second before slipping her hand into Kenneth's, her fingers steady, her back straight. As Kenneth led her gently to the center of the room, Tracy felt 1,000 invisible shackles fall away from her body. The music shifted seamlessly into a soft, elegant melody, and without needing to rehearse, they moved together in perfect harmony. Kenneth leaned down slightly, murmuring, "You're doing beautifully." Tracy smiled up at him, blinking back tears. "I was terrified," she whispered. "You never showed it," he replied with a soft chuckle. Around them, the guests watched, mesmerized, a silent, undeniable acknowledgement forming among them. This was no forgotten woman, no discarded wife clinging to memories. This was someone entirely reborn, standing in the arms of a man who saw her, who chose her not because she was convenient, but because she was irreplaceable. Paul remained rooted to his spot, the wine glass trembling in his hand, the full magnitude of what he had lost settling heavily in his gut. No laughter now, no mockery, only the sound of music weaving around the new queen of the room, and the silence of a man realizing, too late, the treasure he had thrown away. Cindy stood rigid beside Paul, her nails digging crescent moons into her clutch as she stared at the scene unfolding before her. Every fiber of her being screamed to intervene, to claw back the attention, to remind everyone that she, not Tracy, was supposed to be the star tonight. But as the whispers grew louder, as the admiring glances traced the outline of Tracy and Kenneth dancing effortlessly, Cindy felt something cold and slippery coil around her. Fear. Desperation clutched at her throat. She stepped forward hastily, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, forcing a brittle laugh. "Well," she said loudly, her voice too high-pitched, too eager. "I guess Tracy's finally found someone to clean up after her mistakes." A few heads turned, but instead of laughter, Cindy was met with tight-lipped stares and awkward silence. Someone coughed quietly. Someone else shook their head. Her words hung in the air, ugly and shrill against the elegance of the moment. Kenneth barely spared Cindy a glance, his attention wholly devoted to Tracy, but others were not so kind. Ellen, standing nearby, lifted a single arched brow and said coolly, "Funny, it seems like she's the one everyone wishes they were tonight." Cindy's mouth opened in shock, but Ellen was already turning away, dismissing her with elegant finality. The color drained from Cindy's face as she realized the truth clawing at her. She hadn't won. No matter how flashy her dress, no matter how many boasts she tossed into conversations, she had been invisible tonight, overshadowed by the very woman she had tried to destroy. In a desperate last attempt, Cindy clutched Paul's arm, hissing under her breath, "Say something, fix this." But Paul shook her off roughly, his jaw tight, his pride bleeding out of him in slow, humiliating drips. Cindy stumbled back a step, feeling the room's indifference to her plight like a slap. She had fought so hard to be seen, only to discover that in Tracy's silent, luminous victory, she had rendered herself completely, irrevocably forgotten. Paul stood paralyzed in the middle of the ballroom, as if the floor had been ripped out from under him. Around him, conversations resumed, but this time he wasn't at the center of them. No one glanced his way with admiration. No one sought his approval. The only whispers he caught carried pity or disdain, words like fool and blind, slipping through the air like poisoned darts. Cindy hovered near him, her face a mask of strained smiles, but Paul barely registered her presence. His eyes were glued to Tracy, Tracy whose laughter now floated easily, Tracy who danced effortlessly with a man who radiated everything Paul had pretended to be. He could feel it happening, feel the weight of realization crushing his chest. He hadn't just lost a marriage. He had lost a woman who, without needing revenge or theatrics, had eclipsed him entirely. He swallowed thickly, his throat burning. The people he thought would cheer his new life now barely offered him a second glance. "You okay, man?" Someone, an old college friend, muttered as they passed, but there was no sincerity in the words, only awkwardness. Paul nodded stiffly, unable to form a coherent reply. His hand, still clenching his empty glass, trembled slightly. Cindy hissed beside him, "Don't just stand there looking pathetic." But for the first time, Paul had no snide remark, no arrogance to shield himself with. He saw himself clearly now, desperate, hollow, a man who traded gold for glitter, and was only realizing it when it was far too late. Across the room, Tracy caught his gaze for a fleeting second. She didn't sneer, she didn't smirk. She simply offered a serene, almost compassionate smile. The smile of someone who had long since made peace with the past and moved on. That smile shattered Paul more than any shouted accusation ever could. He turned away, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs, every ounce of his so-called triumph crumbling into dust beneath his feet. The music shifted to a softer melody as Kenneth gently spun Tracy in his arms before leading her to the edge of the dance floor. She knew it was time to leave, not out of defeat, but out of dignity. Her moment had passed, and she had claimed it quietly, without needing to drag anyone through the mud. As Kenneth helped her slip on her light shawl, a few former classmates approached with warm smiles, offering words Tracy had longed to hear, but no longer needed for validation. "You look radiant," someone said. "You're glowing," said another. Tracy smiled gracefully, thanking each of them without lingering. She didn't need their approval anymore. Her strength no longer hinged on whether others saw it. Kenneth offered his arm, and she looped hers through it, standing taller than she ever had. Together, they made their way toward the exit, their pace unhurried, their presence impossible to ignore. As they reached the double doors, Tracy paused, glancing back one final time. Paul stood slumped near the bar, shoulders hunched, his confidence bleeding away with every second that passed. Cindy clung desperately to his side, her fake laughter louder than necessary. But no one seemed to be listening. Tracy watched them for a moment, the couple who had once sought to crush her, and felt nothing but a profound, cleansing sense of release. She squeezed Kenneth's hand gently. "Ready to go?" she asked softly. He leaned in, pressing a tender kiss to her temple. "Whenever you are, my love," he murmured. Without another backward glance, Tracy stepped through the doors into the crisp night air, leaving behind the broken remnants of a life that no longer fit her. She hadn't needed revenge. She hadn't needed a dramatic scene. All she needed was to walk away, radiant, unbowed, and finally free. The valet brought Kenneth's sleek black car to the front of the hotel, and Tracy slid into the passenger seat, her heart still thundering with 1,000 emotions. As they drove away, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and silver, but all she could focus on was the soothing warmth of Kenneth's hand wrapped around hers. They rode in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Kenneth spoke, his voice low and sure. "You were magnificent tonight," he said. Tracy turned her head to look at him, and the affection in his eyes nearly undid her. "I was terrified," she admitted with a shaky laugh. Kenneth squeezed her hand. "You didn't show it," he said, smiling gently. "You didn't just survive them, Tracy. You rose so far above them, they can't even touch you anymore." Tears pricked at her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude for herself, for the journey, and for the man who stood by her side without ever trying to dim her light. When they arrived home, Kenneth parked the car and turned toward her fully. For a moment, they just sat there, the soft hum of the engine the only sound between them. Then, Kenneth reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the best way. "No one defines you but you, Tracy," he said, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "Not the past, not their cruelty, only you." Tracy leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as the last shards of old pain melted away. "Thank you," she whispered. Kenneth leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers. "You don't have to thank me," he murmured. "Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." Wrapped in the safety of his embrace, Tracy allowed herself a rare, unguarded moment of peace. She had faced the storm, and she had emerged stronger, loved, and finally, completely whole. Paul stumbled back into his apartment well after midnight, the heavy door slamming behind him with a dull thud that echoed in the empty space. He dropped his keys onto the counter and stared blankly around the cold, minimalist decor, suddenly feeling more like a prison than a home. Cindy had left earlier, furious and embarrassed, muttering about needing space, but Paul barely heard her. His mind was stuck replaying the night in excruciating detail. Tracy's grace, Kenneth's effortless dominance, the whispers that followed him like a death sentence. For the first time in years, he was truly alone, and the silence pressed against him from all sides. He poured himself a drink, the glass clinking against the bottleneck as his hand trembled. As he sat on the edge of the couch, he realized with sickening clarity that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost every ounce of respect he once commanded. The very people who once envied him now pitied him. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Hope it was worth it. No signature? But Paul didn't need one. He knew it was from one of his former friends, disgusted by his behavior. Slamming the phone face down on the coffee table, Paul buried his face in his hands. His world was crumbling. Lawsuits he thought he could suppress were surfacing. Business deals were slipping through his fingers. Colleagues who once greeted him with admiration now offered tight, polite nods and whispered behind his back. Cindy had only been part of the illusion he crafted, an illusion that cracked the moment Tracy walked away, radiant and untouchable. He thought he had upgraded, traded old comfort for new excitement, but excitement faded, and comfort Real comfort never came. What he was left with was the hollow ache of regret, an empty apartment, and a life that tasted of ash. He hadn't just lost Tracy, he had lost himself, and he didn't know how to find his way back. Meanwhile, Cindy's carefully curated image began unraveling faster than she could contain it. After the reunion, word spread like wildfire through their social circles. Whispers of her calculated cruelty, her obsession with overshadowing Tracy, her desperate clinging to Paul's crumbling reputation. All of it bled into the open. Invitations to parties dwindled. Collaborations she'd once boasted about evaporated overnight. She stood in the center of a boutique days later, arguing heatedly with a sales associate about a returned dress, when she noticed two women by the window staring at her, not with envy, but with thinly veiled amusement. Cindy flushed scarlet, tossing her platinum hair over her shoulder as she stormed out. In the past, her tantrums had been forgiven, excused under the label of passion. Now they were simply embarrassing spectacles, proof that without Paul's fading clout, she was nothing more than noise. One evening, she dared to show up at a social mixer she hadn't been uninvited from yet, only to find herself ignored. Conversations shifted away when she approached. Smiles tightened, shoulders turned, subtly but unmistakably. Even worse, she overheard someone whisper, desperate, clinging to scraps. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she retreated into a corner, nursing a drink she could barely swallow. She had spent so long trying to outshine Tracy, trying to paint herself as the winner, the better choice, the queen. But queens didn't scramble for attention. They didn't measure their worth by the wreckage they caused. Cindy realized, too late, that the crown she fought for was worthless because it had been built on pettiness and spite. And now, stripped of the false glamour, she stood exposed, a hollow, bitter woman whose beauty couldn't hide the ugliness festering beneath. No amount of makeup, designer labels, or whispered lies could mask the truth anymore. She had lost, and worse, no one cared enough to remember she had ever played the game. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Kenneth and Tracy's shared home, casting warm, golden pools onto the hardwood floors. Tracy sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open before her, reviewing final touches on the business project she had quietly been building behind the scenes. Kenneth leaned against the counter, watching her with quiet pride. "You're incredible, you know that?" he said, crossing the room to kiss the top of her head. Tracy smiled, her heart swelling not with pride, but with quiet contentment. "I just needed time," she said. "Time to find myself again without the noise." Kenneth pulled up a chair beside her. "You didn't find yourself," he corrected gently. "You were always there. You just stopped hiding." Tracy closed her laptop and reached for his hand. In the quiet spaces they shared, she realized she had blossomed into someone even she hadn't known she could become. Later that afternoon, Tracy walked into her new office, a sleek but modest space downtown where her small but passionate team awaited her. They greeted her warmly, eyes bright with excitement for the official launch of her consultancy firm. She had taken everything she learned from surviving emotional wars, from navigating betrayal, and woven it into a career built on lifting others up. "No one fights alone," Tracy told her team as they gathered for a quick meeting. "We build differently here, with empathy, with strength." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was real. Tracy stood at the window afterward, looking out at the city bustling below. She wasn't chasing validation anymore. She wasn't proving anything to anyone. She was simply living, fully, fearlessly, on her own terms. The old life had crumbled behind her, and in its place she had built something luminous and lasting, shaped not by bitterness, but by the unshakable truth of who she had always been. The evening breeze was cool as Tracy and Kenneth walked hand in hand along the private garden behind their home, the faint scent of jasmine perfuming the air. Lanterns hung low from the trees, casting soft, golden circles onto the stone path. Tracy tilted her head up to look at the stars, a serene smile curving her lips. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Kenneth squeezed her hand gently, his heart pounding with anticipation. They stopped at the center of the garden, where a small table had been set with 2 glasses of champagne. Tracy arched a brow in amusement. "Planning something, Mr. Whitmore?" she teased lightly. Kenneth chuckled, his eyes gleaming under the warm light. "Always," he murmured. Then slowly, he knelt before her, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Tracy's breath caught in her throat. "Marry me again," Kenneth said softly, his voice steady and full of devotion. "This time, not in hiding, not in fear of the past, but because you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, and I want the whole world to know you are mine." Tracy's hands flew to her mouth, tears pooling in her eyes. She could barely breathe, barely think, overwhelmed by the raw tenderness of the moment. "Kenneth," she whispered, her voice breaking. He opened the box, revealing a simple but stunning ring, a solitaire diamond set in a delicate band, elegant and timeless. "Say yes," he said, his voice low. "Say yes to a life where you never have to fight to be loved again." Tracy dropped to her knees in front of him, laughing through her tears as she threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she breathed. 1,000 times. "Yes." Kenneth held her tightly, burying his face in her hair. And in that quiet garden under the stars, without fanfare or witnesses, they promised each other a life built on respect, healing, and an unbreakable love that asked for nothing but their truest selves. Weeks later, Tracy found herself standing at another gathering, but this time it was different. It wasn't a reunion of old classmates or a confrontation of old wounds. It was a small, intimate party Kenneth had thrown for friends and family to celebrate their new chapter. Soft jazz played in the background, laughter floated through the air, and the scent of fresh roses filled the bright sunroom where guests mingled warmly. Tracy wore a soft cream dress that flowed around her like a whisper, her natural beauty shining without effort. Kenneth, never far from her side, introduced her proudly to everyone. Not as someone who needed defending, not as someone who had to earn their place, but simply as his beloved wife. "She's the heart of everything good in my life," Kenneth said in a quiet conversation with an old friend, unaware that Tracy overheard. Her heart swelled so much she thought it might burst. Later, as the crowd thinned and evening deepened into a warm, velvety night, Tracy and Kenneth stepped out onto their balcony, overlooking the sparkling city. Tracy leaned against the railing, the cool air brushing against her skin, feeling more alive than she ever had before. "If someone had told me a year ago I'd be standing here, I wouldn't have believed them," she said, her voice soft and full of wonder. Kenneth wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You were always meant for more, Tracy," he said. "You just needed to walk away from the people too small to see it." She smiled, resting her hands atop his. "Thank you for loving me when I forgot how to love myself." Kenneth kissed the side of her neck tenderly. "You saved yourself," he whispered. "I just held the light until you could see it again." Together they stood there in the gentle night, not needing grand declarations or noisy celebrations. Tracy's story reminds us all, strength doesn't always scream. Sometimes it simply walks away with its head held high. When someone tries to break you, don't fight for a seat at their table. Build your own. And like Tracy, you'll find peace, love, and maybe even something better than you ever expected. If this story moved you, made you think, or made you cheer for Tracy, do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe for more real, powerful stories like this. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply living well.